Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience in their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's Libsyn, ads.com today.
What if you couldn't get your prescription drugs anymore? What would you do? You call yourself the MacGyver of medications. Why?
We'll do whatever it takes. The last time America made an antibiotic was 2004.
I called around to about 70 different pharmacies. Everyone was like, nope, sorry.
People are dying. If we're getting 97% of antibiotics from China, a known adversary, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that's vulnerability we don't need. Well, I have a question for you. What if you couldn't get your prescription drugs anymore? Think about that. What would you do? I don't mean to frighten you, but this is a real scenario, and it is happening as we speak. The U.S. is experiencing one of the most severe drug shortages of our time.
The drug shortage in the United States has reached a 23-year high.
The FDA has not been an effective partner in combating drug shortages.
Data shows 323 medications in short supply across the country, the highest since tracking started in 2001.
Every year, there's more drug shortages to worry about.
Rebecca Taylor says, unfortunately, the shortages have affected IV injectable drugs across the board.
We've had issues with sedatives, pain medications.
Taylor says a lot of the generic drugs are made overseas now.
FDA last testified that around 80% of API facilities and 60% of finished dosage facilities are overseas, including India and adversarial countries like China.
If something happens at those factories, there aren't many backup plans.
If adversarial countries were to cut off the supply, American patients' lives could hang in the balance.
Taylor hopes lawmakers will help implement drug price changes and a way to tell hospitals about expected shortages.
We must encourage American innovation, increase domestic manufacturing capabilities, and promote the adoption of quality generic drugs.
Now, the U.S. Census Bureau reports more than 60 million Americans are going without the medications they need. Many are life-saving drugs for treating cancer, epilepsy, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and more. Sadly, experts say there's no end in sight for this crisis. And here's proof. Look at this list of prescription drugs on the FDA site. Over 100 medications you may need right now. But I want to give you something else to think about. The drug shortage isn't just putting Americans' health at risk, it's exposed a dangerous vulnerability in our national security. China and India are U.S.'s primary source for pharmaceutical ingredients and account for 91% of all prescriptions written in the United States. That means the drugs you get from your local pharmacy or hospital were probably made in China or some other country. Now, if China just decides to stop exporting drugs to America, it could upend the entire U.S. health system. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. One critical drug in short supply, we're talking antibiotics, which treat infectious and potentially fatal diseases like smallpox and pneumonia, and a whole lot more. What happens if there's an outbreak in America and we're completely out of antibiotics? Would the entire population be at risk? Now, my first guest, Phil, has been a pharmacist for 26 years. He says his business is suffering because of China, and so are his customers. He says America has got a big problem.
The drug shortage almost closed my business. Prices got so bad, availability was gone. I've watched my patients suffer. It is so terrible to tell a parent their child can't go to school or can't function because they don't have their ADD medications. And even worse are the cancer patients. How do you tell them that their medication is not available? I find myself begging from other stores in order to get just enough to get somebody through. But there's a day coming where that's not possible. API, which is an active pharmaceutical ingredient, predominantly are made in China. There's one factory in China that produces 100 of the top 500 medications that the WHO has stated as being essential. When children's Tylenol and ibuprofen shortages happened, it was actually because the Chinese people needed the Tylenol and ibuprofen, and China gave those APIs to the Chinese people first. The strict regulations of the United States have pushed the hand of pharma to move outside the United States. The Chinese worker makes 47 cents an hour. The standard working situation inside of China doesn't require EPA standards. It doesn't have working conditions. There's no OSHA. The FDA shows up to the American factories substantially more than they do the Chinese factories. They're under more scrutiny. How can the American factory, who we would love to have be making it, even start to compete with these people? Because we are so dependent on China for our drugs, this will end up being the perfect storm. It will become a bargaining chip that will make us weak in the world. And they know that they have us because there's no place to get your generic APIs except from China.
Phil the pharmacist. You call yourself the MacGyver of medications. Why?
Because you have to take care of your patients. When the patient comes in, they need something, you have to figure out a way to get it for them. So we have primary children's hospitals down in Salt Lake. We have an abnormally huge number of calls for medications they can't get elsewhere because we will go find powders, we'll take adult dosage forms, we'll get the injectable form, we'll do whatever it takes to get to our patients.
And so if you can't just give them the straight up prescription in capsule form or pill form or whatever, then you have to compound it. You go find the ingredients and you put it together so they can get it in some form.
Yeah, you don't want to have to do that. I mean, you don't get paid enough to do it. You call 6 different manufacturers, you go to every single secondary wholesaler, you do everything you can to get for them. But even then, we're failing. People are going without their medications.
Yeah, and you say by noon every day, it's not unusual for you to have 20 prescriptions that you can't fill if you don't go to some extraordinary lengths.
If it's 20, I feel good about life.
Yeah, that's a good day.
Because you know that these people are going without, and it breaks your heart to watch it.
Okay, explain APIs.
If you make a chocolate chip cookie, if the chocolate chip isn't perfect, the cookie's never going to be great. Chocolate chip is the active ingredient inside of our drugs. So the API is the actual active ingredient. If you buy amoxicillin, there's amoxicillin, and then there's other things in it. The amoxicillin, the actual active ingredient, is being produced majority in China and some in India.
I saw a statistic that said 97% of antibiotics are coming out of China.
So the last time America made an antibiotic was 2004.
Seriously? Now, we can't be that short-sighted. We know we have an adversarial relationship with China. We know that we're always threatening and or imposing tariffs. There's tension back and forth. So at any point, if they just said no more exporting to the U.S. of these antibiotics, how long before we just run out?
A month.
Really?
Yeah.
So fighting infections post-surgically, people getting strep or infections from cuts or stepping on a nail or whatever that can flourish without antibiotics and a person could go septic, we wouldn't have what was necessary to fight that off.
No, economic pressures have pushed on hospitals and pharmacies to a point where you keep maybe 3 days worth of medication in your store. After 3 days, you'd be dried up from what your normal patterns are. We think we're so smart with this on-time inventory system, but we don't keep backups. In 2021, kids' amoxicillin completely disappeared. Have you ever seen a dad cry at the end of the day because he can't get his medication for his kid?
If this is news to y'all, raise your hand. Okay, that's what I thought. Why does nobody know this?
I always say pharmacy's not very sexy. You know, I mean, there's a lot better topics that people like talking about, but if you take a step back and look at every pharmacist out there, you can see that the pressures are getting to them.
Yeah, I can see that. All right, when we come back, a young woman says she can't get the medicine she needs and it's damaged her career and her relationships. We'll be right back. In times of uncertainty, stemming from economic volatility, political shifts, and global events, it's crucial to work together and unite as a country for a brighter future. Amid these challenges, it's important to take proactive steps to monitor and protect your finances and retirement accounts. That's why I'm turning to physical gold and silver to help protect my accounts, and you should too. Gold and silver prices reached record highs this year, and central banks are buying gold like never before. So get started today with Preserve Gold. the only precious metals company I trust and recommend. They have hundreds of 5-star reviews and millions of dollars in trusted transactions. Preserve Gold is giving away a free precious metals guide with information on how to help protect your accounts. Just text Dr. Phil to 50505, and you can get up to $15,000 in free gold and silver with a qualified purchase. So don't wait. Text Dr. Phil to 50505 to claim this exclusive offer from Preserve Gold today.
An emergency shortage of hundreds of prescription drugs. This happened in part because it's not that China is withholding supply, it's that they have a monopoly on a lot of the raw material.
If you think about the national security crisis that this could be, this is not just the poor chap who's developed prostate cancer. We're talking about not being able to supply medicines to our military, for example. Well, that's a big deal. Until somebody says, hey, listen, we're going to change this, I think we're in for a disaster.
Well, as you just heard from my friend Chris Como at News Nation, we're in the middle of a national drug shortage that shows no signs of improvement. 29-year-old Samantha says she's taken ADHD medication for the past 14 years, but when she found out the drug she relied on was no longer available, she says it turned her world upside down.
I struggle with ADHD, and this nationwide drug shortage is real. I started calling around to different pharmacies, and I kid you not, I called 70 different pharmacies in 1 week, and not a single pharmacy within a 2-hour driving vicinity that I called had Vyvanse in stock. I started driving to different local CVS, Walgreens, different mom and pop pharmacies just to figure out if maybe I'd have better luck in person. Not a single one had it in stock. And I even had a pharmacist say to me, well, why do you need it so bad? Anybody wanted to know what it looks like to move while you have ADHD when you don't have your medication? This is what it looks like. Boxes, piles everywhere that I can't make sense of. I am in the middle of moving right now, and I'm so overwhelmed, and I'm stuck in freeze mode because I'm overwhelmed. And I go to my medicine cabinet to go and get my Vyvanse, and lo and behold, I have 2 pills left right now, and I wish I were kidding. I am totally not trying to sound like a drama queen right now, but this Vyvanse shortage is ruining my life.
Samantha, you started taking this medication 14 years ago. Did this work for you?
It worked incredibly. It got me through high school.
And when you started trying to get the prescription refilled and they said, hey, we don't have it, you started shopping. Right?
Absolutely.
And so pretty soon they started looking at you like, hey, lady, what are you doing here? They thought maybe you were misusing it.
Exactly. I felt like pharmacists were looking at me like I was, partaking in drug-seeking behavior. And it was very demeaning and very dehumanizing because I believe that this medication is something I need.
And you say it's affected your career, your relationships, because you're a different person with and without it.
Absolutely.
Are you on it right now?
I am not on it right now, no.
Okay. All right. Stay calm.
I'll do my best.
Listen, this is a neurological disorder, and I've dealt with it for years and years. And I think it's a way overdiagnosed disorder, but for those who actually need it, who have neurological dysregulation, it's a real problem. And you've seen the results when you're on it and when you're not. How do you change when you're not on it?
When I'm not on it, I feel chronically overwhelmed. Like every decision I make, whether it's major or minor, I wait until the last minute and things just implode. And I feel like that has affected my home life, my relationships, my career. I am a business owner and an entrepreneur, and I work in weddings, I do makeup. And when you're dealing with people who are, about to have the most important day of their lives, you want to be, on your A game. And I feel like I haven't been showing up as that for my clients. And it disappoints me as well as the clients I serve, and it has not been fun.
What's her alternative?
They'll probably try to change her medications to something else. What she said about pharmacists being a little, I'll say, judgmental, they actually have trained us to do that, to watch really close rather than look at the patient. They have us look at the drug rather than seeing the person. Mm-hmm. That she could switch to a different medication, but the one that she's on releases lower in the GI tract, so most people won't get that nervousness around it. It delays it a little bit. If I switched it to something else, most likely she'd be really jittery, And then she'd be a bear at the beginning of the wedding, and then she'd be fine. And then at the end of it would start wearing off. So each one of them have different time frames.
Right. And you found what works for you.
Vyvanse works incredibly for me.
It's been gone for 7 months.
It's crazy.
And then when it did come back, it went from being $138 a bottle. It cost me now $500 a bottle for the generic.
Yeah.
For the generic?
For the generic. So that means on average, on my Vyvanse generic prescriptions I get right now, I'm losing $400 a prescription if I choose to take care of my patients.
So you're losing hundreds of dollars when you service your patients?
Yeah, negative reimbursed claims because of the shortages now are up about 30%. It's better for me to give you money and say, go to the next pharmacy than it is for me to dispense it. But they're my patients. You can't do that to people.
I called around to about 70 different pharmacies. Within the span of a few days, everyone was like, nope, sorry, try the next one. It was something that I've never even imagined would happen, but now I feel like I see it a little bit differently from your side, and I understand why.
You're an example of this having an impact right now.
Yes.
And it's getting worse. All right, coming up, my next guest says during the pandemic, the U.S. Department of Defense gave his company $96 million to make personal protective equipment for American healthcare workers. It's been 3 years, and he says he's got absolutely nothing to show for it. But yet he got $96 million. So what went wrong? We're going to talk to him next.
China's really quietly stealing the agriculture sector in the United States. Before China started coming into this area, I could buy decent farm ground for $2,500 to $3,000 an acre. Now it's $15,000, $20,000. They're now controlling the buying stations, the grain elevators, and they're controlling the food. Stealing our seed technology. This is national security.
Well, that was fourth-generation farmer John, who I spoke with a couple of months ago. John told me he was in danger of losing his family farm because Chinese nationals with close ties to the Chinese Communist Party are buying up land around him, driving up the values, and as a result, he can't even afford to pay the taxes on the land he owns, let alone buy additional land. I want to reiterate tonight that we're talking about the Chinese government, not the Chinese people. I want to bring two more voices into this conversation. Dan Izaki is a founding member of the American Medical Manufacturers Association and CEO of the United States Technology. He says, as someone who manufactures PPE, this is personal protection equipment right here in the U.S., he feels the U.S. government has abandoned him for China. And Peter Mattis is the president of Jamestown Foundation and has written and spoken extensively about the Chinese government and Chinese Communist Party. He says the Chinese government is callous, malicious, and Americans should be worried. You got $96 million from the government, but that's a drop in the bucket when you're trying to compete with China, where they're paying 47 cents an hour for labor, right?
Absolutely.
How do you compete with that?
So it's a great question. I'll compete with anyone, right? Based on skill, based on technology, based on innovation. But when you're competing against a national power that has the ability to subsidize, control, and make their businesses more competitive globally than we are, it's really not a fair fight, right? The goal is to dominate, and when we're basically looking at it from the perspective of, we're, for-profit businesses, we work off of innovation, American ingenuity, and grit and spirit. But the reality is, how can you compete when I have to pay my workers, $48,000 to $52,000 a year for a warehouse, employee versus someone who's making pennies in China? If it's not slave labor, by the way, that's a possibility too.
That is a possibility, but 47 cents an hour is what our research is turning up. That's $4 a day, maybe.
Right, but it's not only that, it's also, buying cheap Russian oil, right, to provide the power, right? Because all of these factories run on power, right? It's everything. And they're just giving their companies the most advantages possible, making sure that the industry here never gets started.
So, Peter, what is the goal of the Chinese Communist Party in all of this?
The Chinese Communist Party has been consistent for the last 100 years to take China back onto the world stage as a great power, to lead the world, and to define the values and the value chains, if you will, for industry in the way that the world works. And in some sense, the way they describe a new type of international relations or a community of common destiny for mankind is about taking this system that they have internally where the party represents everyone. This is their claim to being a democratic party. That they incorporate those interests and they decide what's important, and that the world will sort of funnel through Beijing rather than through the ways in which it's worked now to date.
And the impact, as we're discussing here, is that nobody can compete, and therefore, are we not completely at their mercy?
Well, we still have options. There's production all around the world, and many of those are much friendlier countries and ones that we can deal with. But if we don't change our attitude on this a little bit, we're going to keep seeing these problems. We keep thinking that we're dealing with a market, but there's not a market-based solution. There aren't sort of little incentives you can do when you have coercive tech transfer and intellectual property theft and blocking companies that once they're able to produce domestically in the PRC, that they'll block out foreign companies from selling into that market. It's kind of like preparing for a football game and thinking that more time on the practice field, more time in the gym and preparing is going to get you there and you'll win the game when someone's going to come along while you're in the corridor and crack your knee with a crowbar, right? We have to think about, yes, preparing for the field, but also how do you protect your knee if someone's going to break it?
Yeah, so they're just not playing fair. And is there any way to compensate for that, or do you just have to become independent from China?
You have to start figuring out a way to take the risks down. That when you create alternatives and you create options, it's a lot harder for someone to coerce you and to put pressure on you. Even if Beijing didn't do it deliberately, if a war broke out, all of that shipping going in and out of China is going to stop, whether or not it's deliberate or not. Right? So by having everything there or relying so heavily on that, there's no way that we can break ourselves, even when it's not necessarily a deliberate effort to harm us.
Well, it may not be a deliberate effort to harm us, but the result is still the same. I mean, she still can't get her medication. So what's our government doing about it?
I can tell you, as someone who was working on Capitol Hill during part of COVID time, like, one of the problems from government is just knowing what is going on. And even companies don't know what is going on sort of 2 and 3 tiers down in their supply chains. And so one of the things that has been done that I think this administration did a nice job on was to at least start the data collection effort to know, where do these come from? Where do they go? FDA inspections at overseas factories are down to the extent that we were ever even able to get into factories that were in the PRC. But at least at the starting point, it's knowing what these supply chains actually are.
Yeah, this isn't a political thing. It's 17 years. I mean, we're paying people to deal with this, and nobody's dealing with it. You're saying they're starting to collect some data. Well, whoop-de-doo. It's been 17 years.
Well, here's an honest question about this. Do we want government to produce these itself? If that's what it's going to take, then that's something that we have to consider. And if we're thinking about it as a market, then we're going on to a tilted playing field. So we've got to think about how we block this off.
So if I can add, during the beginning of the pandemic, maybe the Department of Defense knows where the bullets and the missiles are, but in terms of the medical supply chain, there was no information. So when the White House put together a Joint Acquisition Task Force, they started to try and figure out, what do we have and what do we need? And it was shocking that information didn't exist. And I know that, today HHS has a program where they're trying to invest and put all that data together. But, that requires a lot of partnerships between government and business and bringing that all together. And hopefully they're working on it.
Sounds to me like we got a bunch of people having a meeting to plan a meeting to create a committee to have another meeting.
Absolutely.
And in the meantime, she can't get her medication.
Absolutely.
He can't get what he needs for his patients. Nobody's doing anything about it.
Absolutely correct.
Somebody needs to put verbs in their sentences and start doing something. I mean, I'm just saying.
So 90% of our medications are generic medications. We spent $60 billion on weight loss drugs. We spent about $100 billion on generic drugs. The answer's already built in there. The money's already there. And when you consider that the US government funds about 50% of all drug purchases between Medicaid and Medicare, they have the power. They just have to shift it from the top end to the bottom end and take care of 90% of the people.
Yeah, that just seems to me to be way too commonsensical. When you look at drug shortage in the United States, the percentage of people being prescription medication shortage range from 7.3 to 19.8. This is affecting people coast to coast. People are dying. There are people with cancer medication that can't get it. Coming up, according to the USDA, China and other foreign nationals own over 40 million acres of U.S. farmland. Does it make sense to allow our adversaries to put down roots inside our borders? We'll talk about that next, and I'll tell you how all this ties together. Look at this map. The red is where the Chinese government has funded buying major farmland.
Yeah.
And then superimposed on that are some of our most strategic military bases. We've allowed them to come in and buy up agricultural land, wind farms. They're surrounding our military bases.
Right.
There could be 100,000 or more potential terrorists on American soil right now today.
We've never been so close to World War III as we are right now.
Well, that's a clip from a recent interview I did with President Trump. And did you hear what he said? We've never been so close to World War III. If that doesn't get people's attention, it should. Let me remind you, the CCP is buying land near critical U.S. military installations. Now, in this video shot by Jorge Ventura for News Nation, you can see a long line of Chinese nationals at the border trying to enter our country. And here's some shocking numbers. According to Homeland Security, this year alone, 24,214 Chinese nationals have tried to cross the southwest border illegally. And in this simple sample, you notice a lot of these are military age. And if you look, their backpacks are all pretty uniform. They all have kind of military haircuts. How'd they get here? Because it's my understanding in China, you don't just decide, hey, I'm going to take a vacation and go to the United States and pick up and go. They've either been sent here or they've gotten permission to get here. We've discovered that there are instructional videos and printouts that tell them how to get here. And when you look at this map, there's one that's a wind farm, but they don't have any propellers on them. They just got the towers, and they have listening devices and video devices on them. So I'm really curious, who's paying attention to this? Why are we allowing this dependency? Why are we allowing these people into the country? Why are we allowing this land to be purchased in strategic locations? Maybe we should form a committee and have a meeting to plan a meeting about that before the whole damn map goes red.
Thank you for having this show and sort of raising this issue, because once I think people understand how desperate the situation is, maybe that will cause our lawmakers to be more involved and more incentivized to make the changes that are required. Because we do have a path forward. We can manufacture stuff in America. If we're allowed to compete fairly, we'll crush. It's not a problem. All day long, we'll compete. But if you're competing against someone that's got a 100-year time horizon who wants, global dominance, and we're not responding to them in the same ways, then we can't, and we'll never have an industry here.
What do you think needs to happen?
One, if we want to protect industry, we have to actually, as much as we don't want to think about tariffs and other forms, we actually have to block off what's there. One of the reasons why we have SpaceX is because we blocked China out of the commercial space industry, and we did it decades ago because of how closely linked it is to the military. We created a space for someone like Elon Musk to come and mobilize resources and gather people together and to see a market and to go forth. And now they're chasing us. The Chinese have a number of commercial space companies trying to catch up. If we want to review investments like this is a place where our government is actually overwhelmed with the amount of screening that they have to do for visas for companies investing, that we don't have enough China expertise across our government to actually clear off some of these things. One of the departments that's responsible for looking at whether or not a company is using Uyghur forced labor, where they're moving Uyghurs out of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region out to factories on the East Coast, they don't even have people with Chinese language skills to do the research. They're using Google Translate to try to do some of this research. And I can tell you, having done some desk research like that, you can't do it without Chinese. If you don't know it, you can't do it. So in some sense, it's about building our entire competence for dealing with China, not just at a place like the State Department or the Defense Department where we think it's normal, but in places like HHS, in Treasury, in Commerce, and Department of Homeland Security. Because many of these problems are too big to give it to just one person and say, okay, here's your part, here's your part. No one can do the whole thing by themselves.
We have a $35 trillion deficit. I'm not talking about one person trying to do it. I think with $35 trillion deficit, we could probably scare up more than one guy.
Yeah, but right now we have a couple of hundred people, students that are studying in China. That's down from several thousands years before. Those that did study in China have difficulty getting a clearance if they want to work in a government job. And we haven't figured out how to solve that problem, which is as ludicrous as it sounds, but it's a real one. We should be looking at it. There's a major issue that when you think about, for example, when the PLA was sending scientists and engineers to do research at American universities, right? They get a visa from the State Department, right? They filed a fraudulent sort of visa application. But in this process of pre-COVID, it was about 350,000 students that were studying inside the United States. They would be flagged maybe 60, 70, 80,000 visas for further review. State Department had 5 people with the technical expertise to look at what those people were studying to know whether or not there was a national security risk. Are they going to review that many? Can Customs review all of the ones with visas when they come through?
Well,
and maybe the university should have looked at the fake university that was being used on that application, right? Wow. It's a whole process where everyone has to step up to do it, and it can't be pointing fingers around to say, well, that's your job, that's not mine.
Well, maybe we don't need 86,000 more IRS agents to harass the population. Maybe let's hire those people to protect the country from our foreign adversaries instead. Coming up, have we scared you enough to see this is a real problem? So what can you do about it? We'll talk about that next.
I think you should be stockpiling your medications. Here's my suggestion. Most of the medications that you buy are not that expensive. If you call people like my pharmacy and say, I would like to buy a year's supply, for most of your medications for under $100, you can have an extra year in your storage. And then you have them just in case.
If China stopped exporting drugs and drug ingredients, APIs, some say we would have just 2 months until our drug supply was depleted, maybe less. And the United States, the world's biggest superpower, lost control over the health and security of the American people. Now, we've got a almost $300 billion trade deficit with China, so we're buying a lot more than we're selling. We're exporting $151 billion. We're importing $536 billion. That's up 26% since 2012, so it's getting worse, not better. This is a very complex issue. I get that. But it seems to me that you understand this way better than I ever will. Does it frustrate you that there's not more action being taken?
Yes, it's in part because the party's intentions have been clear for decades. And we could kind of say that, oh, well, we could wish this away and say, well, maybe it's different. Maybe we can have some kind of different relationship. Maybe it will change. But Xi Jinping very clearly ended all of that. And he stepped out as party general secretary in 2012, and you could see that he had a Maoist bent to him. You could see that he was very clear about what those priorities are. And yet, when you talk to people in government and people in business, it's shocking that the number of companies, for example, that actually don't know much beyond their immediate contractors. So they don't know where some of the components are coming way, way down the chain. And by the way, we consider ourselves best in class that we know to the second or third level out, people that we don't necessarily have a direct contract with. But how do you fix it when people aren't even curious? When the people that are responsible for making things haven't even thought about where these components come from?
Well, that's why we're talking about this right now. And it's shocking to me that we're the only ones talking about this. That's why I launched this network, to talk about things that other people were either afraid to talk about or didn't have interest in talking about. This affects every one of you, me, every one of you at home. You get sick and can't get the medications that you need, which is the case right now for a whole lot of people. That's a problem. That's a real right now problem. We have another pandemic, and it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. We've got first responders in trash bags wearing industrial gloves. I mean, come on. China's making those gloves about half of what you can make them for here, right?
Correct. Well, they're selling them for about half.
Right.
We can make them here. So
they're making them for a lot less, but they're selling them for half. No, I don't think so.
I think they're making them for probably more.
Well, with 47-cent labor and cheap oil, they're making them cheaper, a whole lot cheaper than you're making them. Didn't we just dump hundreds of millions of PPE because it expired?
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is a strategic national stockpile where they buy a bunch of stuff, they put it on a shelf, and then they just sort of say, okay, it's past its life, and then it gets thrown away. That whole thing needs to be overhauled. In the last budget that was just recently approved, I think there was $900+ million for the SNS for replenishment of a whole bunch of products, right? So, as industry, the American Medical Manufacturers Association, we interface with HHS and all the governmental agencies, and we're like, well, why don't we use some modern ideas like vendor managed inventory? Like, for instance, why do you need to stockpile it and pay to stockpile it and manage it? Why not contract with manufacturers such as us or distributors and say, okay, we need to know that we have this much product on the shelf at any given time, and we'll make sure that you have that much product on the shelf at any given time, and you can come and see it, and we'll, first in, first out, so it'll always be fresh, right? These are things that need to happen, and I don't know if we're really seeing those changes yet.
Yeah. Okay, my final thoughts, stay with us. Look, one of the things you have to do is stop and think, what's China's long-term plan? I don't consider myself to be an expert in geopolitics at all, not even almost, sort of, kind of, maybe. But I don't think it takes a geopolitical expert to know that China wants to dominate the world. They want their plan, their form of government to be the model for the rest of the world. I don't think many people would disagree with that. I don't trust the Chinese Communist Party. And I want to be real clear. I'm not talking about the Chinese people. I think they would like to get out from under that form of government just as bad as we would like to see that form of government go away. So please don't take anything we're saying here to be something that you should have animus towards your Chinese neighbors here in America. That's not the issue. They're probably here to get away from that, and they don't like it any better than we do. So trust me, they're not running the Chinese Communist Party. They wouldn't be here. And we have to be clear that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't have our best interest at heart, and they love having leverage over us. And nothing will embolden other countries, allies and enemies, to believe we have lost our way, that we have a broken and corrupt government, that we are having a political and social civil war, than to continue the political polarization that exists to some degree and is amplified by bloodthirsty political parties who live to see the failure of their counterparts rather than to work peacefully and respectfully towards common interest in the manner and tradition that created the greatest social experiment in history, the United States of America. I'm saying we've got people down there trying to solve these problems. I'm not sure they're really problem solvers. Are they really wanting to solve the problem, or do they think, well, this is what keeps us all in jobs? If they're not willing to try and solve this problem, we need to get people in there that will. And I'm not talking Democrat, Republican, just people on Capitol Hill. Look, our lives are not controlled so much by the people that we elect as the people that are appointed into these jobs and agencies that make these decisions. And somehow or another, we need to get the attention of the people up there that we're not okay with this. I was saying before, let's have a meeting to create a committee, to have another meeting, to set an agenda, to have another meeting, and just keep kicking the can down the road. At some point, you got to come up with some kind of a solution and implement that. And I strongly believe that if we're getting 97% of antibiotics from a known adversary, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that's vulnerability we don't need, and we need to come up with something to solve that. Like you say, you just shift your priorities and where the money's going. If this gets your attention, if you feel a vulnerability here, you need to make it known to your senators and representatives. I've had all of this that I intend to take, and you either start getting this fixed or I'm going to find somebody that will. We're in an election year. They care. And let me tell you something. I've had many senators and representatives tell me when they get 10 phone calls or 10 letters, they multiply that by 10, 20, 100 in terms of the impact they think it has out there. So it makes a difference when you take the time to let them know. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's a pretty fair statement.
Yeah. So of all the people we got watching here, all the people in the audience and at home, every one of you pick up the phone and call your senator or representative, or you sit down and write a letter and send it to them. All of a sudden they're going to go, hey, we need to get ourselves busy about this because they're sick and tired of it, and it's going to be reflected when it comes election time. I'm just saying, you have more power than you realize. So this is a call to action. Let's do something with this. Join the Merritt Street Army here, and let's start making some noise. There's one show I especially want you to check out. Morning on Merritt Street is hands down the best way to start your day. It's packed with news and entertainment, and most importantly, unique and fascinating ways to improve your life. And it's also a ton of fun. Join Dominique and Fanchon every morning at 8, 7 Central on Mornings on Merritt Street, wherever you watch. And of course, you can always watch for free on Merit Plus app. Just go to the Apple Store or Google Play and you can download it for free. I want to thank all of my guests for being here tonight. My new book, We've Got Issues, How Americans Can Stand Strong for This Country's Soul and Sanity, is on sale everywhere books are sold right now, and it talks about this very thing. If you don't have a copy, you should get one. For more information about tonight's episode, log on to drphil.com. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.